When you think of Martin Luther, what comes to mind? Probably the titan of the Reformation, right? A man of just unshakable revolutionary faith. But behind that image, there was this hidden lifelong war, a battle he fought not against popes or princes, but against this profound darkness inside his own soul. So today, let's explore that little-known struggle of one of history's most influential figures. Close to the gates of death and hell. I mean, these aren't the words of some distant academic theologian. This is a raw, desperate cry from Luther himself, written in 1527 during one of the worst depressive episodes of his life. He said he was trembling in all his limbs, that for him, Christ was wholly lost. Which just begs the question, right? How could the man who stood against the most powerful institutions in the world, the man who inspired millions with his certainty, feels so completely and utterly abandoned himself?
Well, to even begin to understand what he was going through, we have to use his word for it. This wasn't just sadness or depression as we might think of it today. It was something he called an Anfechtung. This word, Anfection, it's a full-blown spiritual crisis. It's the feeling that God isn't just gone, but that he's actively hostile towards you. It's this terrifying assault where your faith itself just feels like it's crumbling into dust.
So what would bring these on? Well, physical illness was usually a result of them, not the cause. Sometimes a big event could be a trigger, like back in 1527, he felt this crushing guilt that his followers were being martyred for their faith while he was safe. But often, and this was the most terrifying part, these crises would just descend on him for no tangible reason at all.
But here's the wild part. Luther didn't just endure these assaults. He actually came to see them as necessary. He believed that without going through these temptations, no one could truly understand Scripture or faith or the love of God. For him, hope was totally meaningless unless you had really wrestled with despair first. Okay, so if these attacks are both this horrible thing and a necessary part of faith, how in the world did he fight back? Well, he developed this fascinating and really practical toolkit for the soul, a set of strategies to wage his own war for faith. It really came down to a two-pronged strategy. First, there was the head-on attack, just directly confronting the source of his despair. And second, there was the way of indirection, basically a strategic retreat, diverting his mind away from the struggle. All right, let's dive into that first approach, the direct confrontation. And this is where things get really interesting, because this is where Luther gets into arguments with the devil and even with God. Now, for what he considered his lesser struggles, Luther personified his enemy as the devil. And that gave him a target he could mock without, being blasphemous. So when he was plagued by feelings of his own sinfulness, he'd fire back with this biting scorn, saying stuff like, "Saint Satan, pray for me. Physician, heal thyself." He literally used humor and contempt as weapons. But the devil, that was just the warm-up. Because in his absolute darkest moments, the real assailant wasn't some demon, he felt it was God himself. And that led to an even more audacious strategy. Get this, Luther would actually argue with God. He would, in his own words, dispute with great impatience, basically holding God accountable to the promises he'd made in the Bible. He believed that even when all he could feel was God's big no, he had to fight through that feeling to find the deep, hidden yes underneath it all, trusting the promise over his own terrible experience.
But, sometimes going head-on is just not the right move, and Luther knew that. This led to his second strategy, the way of indirection, which is this surprisingly practical guide to survival. And look, Luther was no fool. He was a realist. He warned, don't argue with the devil. Because as he put it, the devil has thousands of years of experience and knows all your weak spots. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is just refuse to get in the ring. And his advice for how to do that, it's incredibly, almost shockingly, down to earth. First, he said, shun solitude, go find friends, even if you just talk about silly, irrelevant stuff. Second, seek merriment. Enjoy life's simple pleasures like good food, music, and laughter. Third, get angry. Use that energy to push back the despair. Fourth, embrace the love of your family. And finally, go do physical work. He literally advised that a good way to exorcise the devil is to go spread manure on the fields. But what happens when fighting back doesn't work and running away doesn't work either? Luther had one final, ultimate anchor, the foundation that held firm when his entire inner world was just collapsing.
You gotta remember, Luther had already rejected the authority of popes and councils, and now his own feelings were telling him he was doomed. He was completely lost, and he desperately needed something outside of himself, an objective reality to grab onto. And that psychological need actually became the bedrock of his whole theology. And that one solid thing he could hold on to? It was Scripture. For Luther, the true pilgrimage, the real source of certainty, wasn't some physical place like Rome. It was right there, in the pages of the Bible. That was his one unshakable ground. And he wasn't just reading these texts like a textbook, for doctrine. He entered into them. He found this profound solidarity in the struggles of biblical characters. He saw his own battles reflected in theirs, and he drew real strength from their stories. Just listen to how he talks about Abraham's sacrifice. Luther paints this devastating psychological picture. Abraham isn't just being obedient, he's tormented because it seems like God is a liar. As he's preparing the wood, Luther writes, he was thinking all the time that these logs would consume his son. And the tension just builds as they're walking, right? The father knows this awful secret. And then the gut punch, the heart-wrenching question from his innocent son. Father, here is the fire and here the wood, but where is the lamb? And then, at that final moment, the knife is in the air, the angel cries out. And from this absolute rock bottom, Luther pulls out this incredible reversal. He says, we think, in the midst of life we die, but God's truth is the exact opposite. Nay, in the midst of death we live. So, this intense, lifelong struggle, it wasn't just some private agony he went through. It was actually forged into the very heart of his legacy, and it produced one of the most powerful and enduring hymns ever written. I mean, it is absolutely no coincidence that in 1527, the year of his worst depression, the year he felt he was at the gates of hell, that's when he wrote A Mighty Fortress is Our God. The hymn was born directly out of the fire of his Anfechtung. And when you hear the words, you can just feel the battle in them. This isn't abstract theology, it is a warrior's cry from the trenches. Though the fiends on every hand were threatening to devour us, they cannot overpower us. This is defiance forged in the crucible of profound personal suffering. So Luther's story kind of leaves us with this powerful question, doesn't it? What if true faith isn't the absence of doubt? What if maybe the strongest faith is the one that has to battle that doubt and win every single day?